I froze when, at the company party, I saw my wife dancing with the boss while I was away. It took my eyes too long to comprehend what they were seeing, but my body reacted before my mind. I walked towards them, as if crossing a minefield in silence, my heart crumbling with each step. When I approached, she saw me first. And in that instant, something inside her shattered. It wasn't fear of being caught. It was panic. It was amazement. As if she had seen a ghost, as if my presence revealed something that not even she was ready to face. The look on her boss's face, next to her, was different. It was calculated, icy. A look of someone who knew but didn't care. As if he was sure she wouldn't have the courage to tell me. I said good night, that was all. I left with my stomach in pieces and my soul crushed between my shoulders. I didn't scream, I didn't ask anything. I got in the car like someone running away from a fire, and drove without blinking to my lawyer's house. There were sleepless days, long nights like endless tunnels, trying to understand where I had lost myself, or worse, where we had lost ourselves. The love we built with promises, Sunday breakfasts, last-minute trips, laughter on the couch, was now ash, dust and silence. She didn't deny it. She didn't lie. But she didn't kneel either. She just cried in silence, and let me sign the papers like someone watching their own name disappear from the wall of their house. I left. And she stayed, in the same house where I buried my dreams. And I went on, with my chest open and my eyes dry, trying to breathe in a world that no longer made sense. Rebuilding a life is like putting together a jigsaw puzzle backwards. First, we discover everything that's missing. And only later, much later, do we begin to understand where to fit the new pieces. Months passed. One day after another, I relearned how to wake up, how to walk, how to smile slowly. Until she knocked on my door. Literally. Her eyes filled with urgency, anguish, regret. As if only at that moment had she understood the magnitude of what she had done. She said she missed me. That she had lost herself. That what she had with him was not love. That everything she was still mine. But it was too late. Because I had also lost myself, yes. But unlike her, I had found myself again. And what was waiting for me on the other side of my pain was not the same version of myself. It was a new one. A stronger one. One that now knew exactly what she did not want to experience again. She didn't expect to find me in peace. And even less so next to another woman. The surprise was visible. The pain on her face, inevitable. But what destroyed her, what really tore her apart inside, was when she learned that I had always known. That I had seen everything in her eyes. Every detail. Every unspoken lie. Every hidden touch. Every forced apology. I knew. And yet, I chose silence. I chose not to shout, not to humiliate, not to scandalize. I preferred to preserve my dignity in the midst of the storm. And she discovered, there, in the hallway of my new life, that I was the only one who had tried to save her. And yet, she let me sink alone. During all that time, she believed that the pain was mine alone. That the betrayal was an impulsive mistake. That an apology and a long hug would be enough for everything to go back to the way it was before. But what she didn't understand, what she only understood too late, is that some mistakes cannot be undone. Some pains mold. And once molded, I no longer fit inside her. Nor she inside me. I remember the last time I saw her with him, before the end. She smiled. A brief, guilty smile, but still, she smiled. It was one of those smiles that burns. Not because of what it shows, but because of what it hides. And I understood, right then, that she wasn't cheating on me out of anger, or absence. She was cheating on me because, at some point, she thought she could live without me. And it was this certainty of hers that hurt more than the act itself. The conviction that I was replaceable. But now, she was the one who felt it. The emptiness. The space that no one else fills. The feeling of having lost something that can no longer be found. She tried, yes. She sent messages. Letters. She showed up in places where she knew I would be. But my absence was firm. My absence was the answer. And the cruelest thing of all is that I still remember the smell of her hair. The way she said my name when she was distracted. I remember her laugh. The way she would lean her forehead against mine when she wanted to apologize without words. I remember. Because cheating is not erasing. It is tearing. And everything that is torn, no matter how much it is sewn together afterwards, never goes back to being the same. She lost me the moment she decided to live alone, something that we should have faced together. And now, every memory she has of us, lives only in her. In me, it became a scar. And a scar doesn't feel pain. But it also doesn't feel love anymore. In the last message she sent me, she wrote, "I didn't know that day at the party would be the last day I'd have you around. I didn't know that look was your farewell." And she was right. Because it was exactly that day, while she danced with him and smiled as if I were a stranger, that I decided to say goodbye. Not in words. But in soul. Today, I look back not with anger, but with a strange gratitude. Because it was into that abyss that I fell, that I discovered what I was made of. It was in her silence, that I found my voice. It was in her contempt, that I found self-love. And it was in the end, that I found a new beginning. But there is one thing she never knew. Something I kept to myself. A truth that, if she had known, she might have begged me on her knees to stay. Something I witnessed that night, that I never told anyone. Not her. Not the world. One last memory. One last look. One last unspoken sentence. And this revelation, as silent as it is devastating, still awaits its moment. Because it is she, who explains everything. Everything she never knew. And everything I always knew. Welcome to the channel. Here, we make one thing clear from the beginning: we do not support, encourage or romanticize any type of cheating. All the stories told are fictional, but they carry profound truths. They show how a single wrong choice can destroy lives, hearts and futures. Get ready, because what you're about to hear now is intense, true in emotions and with an outcome that will leave you speechless. Sit down, take a deep breath, and hold on tight. The story is about to begin. She always knew how to walk into a room and make herself noticed, even when she didn't say a single word. Julia had a quiet elegance, the kind that you can't buy or learn. It was natural, it flowed with her. Her gestures were slow but firm. The way she tied her hair, the way she looked into someone's eyes, the way she let out a small smile as she listened, everything about her seemed serene, almost hypnotic. Thomas, on the other hand, was the definition of stability. He had the kind of presence that brings security, like a house with a light on waiting for someone to come back. He wasn't a man of grand gestures, but what he said, he did. And when he promised, he kept his promises. He was discreet, focused, and, above all, trustworthy. They met when they were young, in college. It wasn't love at first sight, but it was a connection that grew slowly, at the right time, in the right place. It started with lingering glances in the hallways of campus, casual conversations that grew longer, until one day he waited for her outside a class and invited her to have coffee. It wasn't a spectacular encounter, but it was real. And it was the first of many. Over time, their relationship developed into a solid foundation. Julia was more outgoing, spoke with emotion, and had the gift of seeing beauty in small details. Thomas was analytical, observant, the type who prefers to listen before giving an opinion. The contrast between them created a perfect balance. She brought color, he brought structure. And it was in this harmony that they decided to get married. The wedding was intimate, on a gray afternoon that ended up being brightened by a ceremony full of laughter and whispered promises between clasped hands. They lived in a quiet neighborhood, in a two-story house with large windows and a modest garden. It was the kind of home where weekends were sacred, where mornings began with the smell of coffee and the sound of the news softly on the kitchen TV. They both worked hard, but they always found time for each other. Julia, a literature teacher, brought home stacks of essays and novels, but also stories that she would tell Thomas at night. He, an administrative manager at a medium-sized company, took his work seriously, but left his problems outside as soon as he walked through the front door. The years passed, and with them came the natural challenges of any long-term relationship. Conversations stopped being intense and became routines about bills, work, and the week's logistics. Dinners became quieter, less about discovering each other and more about keeping up the pace. Still, there was affection. There was a habit of saying goodnight with a kiss, even if it was rushed. There was respect, consideration, a history built together. They liked each other. They knew each other like no one else. Julia could tell when Thomas was worried just by the way he held his glass of water. He could tell when she wasn't well by the way she ran her fingers over her lips, a small gesture, but always present when something was bothering her. There was nothing grand about the life they led, and perhaps that was exactly what kept them so close. The normality, the comfort, the knowledge that they could count on each other. They were not a couple of appearances, they did not care about showing their love on social media or appearing perfect in public. They were intimate, real, with flaws that they learned to accept in each other. Their love was in the subtext, in the small gestures, in the silence shared after a long day. The complicity extended even in the hardest silences, in the patience to wait for the other to calm down, in the wisdom of not trying to solve everything with words. Over time, Thomas learned to listen to Julia's silences. She, in turn, began to understand that not all love is demonstrated with declarations, sometimes it reveals itself in the most subtle details. In their neighborhood, they were seen as the mature, centered couple. They were childless, a decision they had reached by mutual agreement after years of conversation, testing, frustration, and finally acceptance. They transformed what could have been a gap into a space for each other. They traveled, decorated their home the way they wanted, took classes together, and created their own traditions. They had a puppy, Max, who slept at the foot of their bed and was treated like a son. Every Christmas, they made a point of putting up the tree together, listening to the same old playlist, laughing at jokes they had told for years as if they were new. It was this kind of ritual that kept them connected, or so they believed. Over time, Julia became more involved with the school. She participated in projects, coordinated events, and was admired by her colleagues and students. She began to stand out, being invited to lectures and educational meetings. This made her blossom again, rekindling an inner flame that had been low for a long time. And Thomas supported everything. He was always there, in the front row, smiling with pride, filming each presentation. But as her career grew, he began to withdraw. His work demanded more, the demands increased, and he silently let himself be swallowed up by the routine. Not because of neglect, but because he believed that this love was strong enough to endure even without daily watering. Their friends noticed how different they were now, but they still worked. At gatherings, Julia was the center of conversation. Thomas was the attentive observer. There was a discreet distance between them that only those who looked closely could notice. And yet, when he put his arm around her shoulders, or when she asked him to dance even with the music low, there was still a remnant of what they had been. A reflection. An echo. The special dates continued to be celebrated with simple dinners and symbolic gifts. On their last wedding anniversary, he took her to dinner at the restaurant where they had their first date. She smiled, touched his hand on the table and said that she still remembered the smell of the wine they had drunk that night. He didn't say much, but his gaze carried the same tenderness as years ago. It was this kind of moment that made everything seem stable. That gave the feeling that, despite the changes, there was still a home, a harbor, and us there. And it was in this seemingly peaceful context that life began to prepare its blow. A seed that was planted in the invisible, in averted glances, in messages read with the cell phone turned face down, in delays justified by meetings that did not exist. But that was yet to come. On the surface, what was seen was a couple built on a solid foundation. A man who came home every day, who still opened the door for his wife to enter first, who left the last slice of pizza for her. A woman who made his coffee the way he liked it, who knew the songs that made him relax, who kept admiration alive even when desire was dormant. Thomas was a methodical man who lived by predictability. This gave him control. Julia, on the other hand, was always looking for excitement, even if it was disguised as small gestures. The difference between them was never a problem, until it started to become an abyss. What used to be balance became disconnection. But without fights, without scandals. Just silence. And sometimes, silence is the loudest cry a couple can make. They didn't understand, but they were drifting apart in silence. They kept the rituals, but without the soul. They laughed, but with an echo of longing for what they had been. And when the longing for the past starts to be greater than the joy of the present, something is wrong. But it's not always noticed in time. The mornings were the same, with Thomas leaving early and Julia staying a little longer, with time to water the plants and listen to music while she tidied the kitchen. At night, they exchanged quick kisses, shared the couch and the news, slept together like two bodies accustomed but not connected. It was all subtle, warm, comfortable. And it is in comfort that many stories begin to die. Not with a bang, but with the muffled sound of repetition. They still cared about each other. That was obvious. But something was changing. The thing is, change doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes it settles in like a smell you can't identify where it's coming from, but you know it shouldn't be there. And yet you ignore it. Because love, when it's not nurtured, begins to feed on the illusion itself. And the illusion can last for years. But no illusion is eternal. And all silence, one day, speaks. At that time, Thomas spent more time than he would have liked in the office. The company's pace had intensified after an internal restructuring, requiring extra hours, short trips to neighboring cities, nighttime meetings, and phone calls that would invade dinner. He tried to compensate by sending short messages during the day, small gestures like flowers delivered to her work for no reason or boxes of chocolates on the nightstand with hastily written notes. Julia smiled and thanked him, but something about her seemed distant, as if the gesture had come too late, as if that once lovely day was now just another reminder of an absence. She seemed busy, immersed in school projects, new proposals, taking care of cultural fairs, participating in training cycles. She had become a reference among her colleagues, someone who always had something to add. Her posture was vibrant, but there was something in her eyes that didn't match that vibration. A contained, almost imperceptible restlessness, as if she were searching for something she didn't even know what it was. Most nights, Thomas would find her sitting on the couch with her laptop open, typing something intently, or lying down, with headphones on, listening to a podcast. He would ask her if she wanted dinner. Sometimes she would eat alone and say she wasn't hungry, other times they would have dinner together, exchange a few sentences about their day, and then silence would return. A polite silence, comfortable even, but one that left in the air the absence of something that had been constant before, genuine interest in each other. He still watched her, still thought she was beautiful, still felt that twinge of tenderness when she would distract herself by biting her lip or talking to Max as if the dog were her son. But he no longer approached her like he used to. Maybe out of fear of hearing what he didn't want to hear. Maybe because he thought he could just wait for things to go back to the way they were. It was during this lukewarm break that the school's new principal was appointed, Renato. He was young for the position, ambitious, charismatic, and had an energy that contrasted with the calm and patient tone of his colleagues. Julia told Thomas one night when he arrived late that the new principal had bold ideas, wanted to reformulate the methods, and give the institution more visibility. He simply nodded, saying that it was good to see someone with initiative, without going into too much detail on the subject. And from then on, Renato began to appear more and more in her conversations, sometimes casually, sometimes enthusiastically. She talked about how he valued her vision, how she was included in the decisions, how they were building a new pedagogical project together. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but over time, Thomas began to notice a different sparkle when she spoke. An enthusiasm he hadn't seen in a long time. She no longer mentioned only the projects, but the after-work meetings, the coffees to discuss ideas, the weekends dedicated to organizing internal events. Her cell phone started to vibrate more frequently, especially at night. Julia pretended not to, turning the device face down, sometimes leaving the room to answer. When Thomas asked, she said it was work-related, that they had tight deadlines, and that she would explain later. And he believed her. Because he still trusted her. Because believing was easier than facing what could be brewing. One Sunday afternoon, he invited her for a walk. She kindly declined, saying she needed to review some school board agendas. Thomas went out with Max, walking more than usual, trying not to think, trying not to suspect. But something had changed. The bed was now divided by invisible distances. The conversations were short. The laughter was contained. She was there, but she wasn't anymore. Renato became a constant presence without ever actually being there. Thomas noticed the smiles she gave when she read certain messages, the eyes that looked for her cell phone even during dinner. Julia was different. More vain, more careful with the details of her appearance. She resumed the habit of wearing perfume to bed, something she had stopped doing a long time ago. She started sleeping later, saying that she needed to take advantage of the silence to concentrate. And he, increasingly isolated, started going out alone, coming back later, accepting invitations that he had previously refused. Little by little, home became just a space for coexistence. The walls of the house, once complicit in so many intimate moments, now witnessed only parallel absences. One day, while tidying up the hallway closet, Thomas accidentally knocked over a folder with Julia's papers. When he picked them up, he saw a printed sheet with an exchange of emails between her and Renato. They were messages about a conference in another city. Nothing explicit, but the tone was too light for a professional environment. There were subtle nicknames, mentions of inside jokes. One of the phrases stuck in his mind, "That night was different, you made me see colors that were faded." He didn't say anything. He put the sheet away carefully, as if that piece of paper were an open wound that he didn't know whether to heal or let bleed. And that day, for the first time in a long time, he didn't sleep next to her. He stayed in the guest room, claiming back pain. She didn't question it. Julia began to avoid touching others and minimize contact. The excuses multiplied. And the routine, previously full of automatic gestures of affection, became just a functional cycle. A couple functioning like two colleagues sharing the same roof. Until the invitation to Thomas's company party came. He insisted that she go, saying that it would be important for his image to be accompanied. Julia was reluctant, but ended up accepting. She looked beautiful that night. She wore a dark blue dress that he loved, and for the first time in a long time, she applied her makeup carefully. They walked in together, smiled at their colleagues, and toasted. But Thomas noticed that she was impatient. She was fiddling with her cell phone and looking around, as if she were waiting for something or someone. During the event, he had to leave for a few minutes to resolve an issue with the area coordinator. When he returned to the hall, he looked for her among the groups. And that was when he saw her. Julia was dancing. It wasn't just any dance. It was intimate, connected, a choreography of bodies that knew each other. And in front of her, smiling with that same sparkle in his eyes that she had had weeks ago, was Renato. He wasn't from the company. But he was there. Accompanying her. Disguised among the guests, as if infiltrating someone else's territory. Thomas stopped. Time stood still. It wasn't the dance. It was the look. It was the subtle touch on her waist. It was the loose laugh that she hadn't given in months. When they both realized they were being watched, Julia turned pale. Her body stiffened. Renato's hand slid slowly, as if he realized too late the mistake of being there, so visible, so exposed. Thomas said nothing. He just approached with the dignity of someone who had had his heart pierced, but still refused to bleed in public. He wished them both good night, turned his back and left the room under the silent gazes that followed him until the exit. That night, he didn't go home. He didn't look for a bar or friends. He went straight to the lawyer. Not for revenge. But because there, in that ballroom, he understood that there was no more room for him in Julia's life. Not like that. The marriage hadn't been broken by the dance. But the dance was the wordless confession of everything he already suspected. Her body spoke what her lips didn't yet have the courage to say. And he, for the first time, understood that love can die in silence, but betrayal screams. And yet, there was something. A detail he kept quiet. Something he saw that night, something he didn't tell anyone. Not even Julia. Something that made everything fit together, but that would only be revealed later, when chaos had already set in and the words could no longer be taken back. Julia stood paralyzed in front of the door. Her face was pale, her eyes red, her body visibly thinner than it had been a few weeks ago. She was wearing a light coat and a scarf wrapped around her neck, even with the late morning sun high in the sky. When Thomas opened the door, he didn't say a word right away. He just looked at her with the same firmness as always, as if he could see beyond her physical presence. She tried to smile, but the smile she tried died halfway through. He made room, and she walked in slowly, as if each step into that house carried the weight of guilt, of memories, of everything that had been left behind. Thomas didn't offer her coffee or water. He sat in the armchair in front of the sofa and waited. She took a long time to speak, as if she were organizing her thoughts for the 1000th time. She took a deep breath, rubbed her hands together and, in an almost broken tone, said that she missed him, that the nights were cold, that the bed seemed bigger than before, even though it was the same. That she missed the routine, the sound of the cup hitting the saucer, the smell of him mixed with the smell of laundry detergent, the short messages he sent just to see if she had eaten anything. But that was nothing new to him. Thomas knew that regret came after the absence, not before the mistake. She went on to say that everything had become empty, that not even work fulfilled her anymore, that the encounters that had once seemed liberating now tasted like deception, and that the man with whom she thought she would experience something new had simply disappeared from her life weeks after the breakup. Thomas watched her in silence, his hands firmly on his knees, his gaze fixed on her, but without expression. That was when she said she needed to understand, that she couldn't sleep without knowing why he had left that party with that look in his eyes. She wanted to understand what he had seen. And why, even after everything, he hadn't confronted her, yelled, or made a scene. Why he had left without demanding anything. Thomas then stood up, walked to the bookshelf in the living room, picked up a small, dark wooden box, and brought it to her. He handed it to her without saying a single word. Julia opened it slowly. Inside, there was a single photograph. It was the image of her with Renato, taken from afar, at the same party. But it wasn't the photo of the dance. It was an image captured a few minutes earlier, when she hadn't seen him yet. In it, the two were hugging in the corner of the room, their faces close together, as if they were exchanging secrets. Julia put her hand over her mouth. She had never known she had been watched there. It was then that Thomas approached, sat down next to her and, in a serious tone, said that that had not been the only thing he had seen that night. He said that, when he left the salon, he went through the back of the space to get his car. And it was there, outside, under a yellowish streetlight, that he saw something he would never forget. Julia and Renato were together again. She, in silence, leaning against the wall, he whispered something in her ear and held her hand firmly. Thomas did not call out to them, did not interrupt. He stayed there for a few minutes, watching what seemed to be the true version of their relationship, away from the salon, away from appearances. When they walked away, she went back in through the back door and he headed towards the side street. Thomas got back in the car and drove off. That night, he did not just learn about the betrayal. He saw her choice being reaffirmed twice. And that was what destroyed him once and for all. Not the fact that she had gotten involved with another man. But the fact that it had been conscious. Calculated. There was no impulse. There was a decision. Julia bent over on the couch, her eyes filled with tears that she tried to hold back, but that came like a broken dam. She said she didn't know how to justify it. That she thought it was a personal crisis. That she was looking for something outside because she no longer knew what she felt inside. That Renato had words that she hadn't heard in years. That made her feel seen. But at that moment, when she realized that everything had been observed, she broke down. Not because she was caught. But because she understood that, during all that time, he had carried the silence not out of weakness, but out of love. And that hurt more than any scream. Julia then knelt on the floor, in front of him, holding his hands, asking for forgiveness. Not for having done what she did, but for having stopped being who she was. She said that she lost him the moment she started hiding parts of herself. And that, now, all she wanted was to try to start over. Thomas remained silent for long seconds. His eyes were teary, but firm. And then he spoke. Quietly, but clearly. He said that same night, when he got home, he found the last missing piece to understand everything. He said that when he opened his computer to look for a document, he saw that Julia had left an email tab open. She never did that. And there, among messages and attachments exchanged with schoolmates, was a folder called Personal. He hesitated, but clicked on it. Inside, he found drafts of letters that had never been sent. Some to him. Others to Renato. But there was one, in particular, that made him stop. It was a letter written weeks before the party. A long text, divided into intense paragraphs, in which Julia said that she still loved him, but no longer knew how to show it. That she felt suffocated because she was always the one waiting. That she wanted to feel again what she felt at the beginning. And that, if she couldn't, she would look outside for what she could no longer find at home. She said that she had tried to reconnect, but that Thomas was too distant. That she needed more. More color. More touch. More risk. That letter was never sent. But it said everything. And it was there, reading each line, that he understood that the betrayal had not originated with Renato. It had originated before. It was born from their silence. From their lack of listening. From the fear of talking truthfully. And then he cried. Not because of the pain of being betrayed. But because of the pain of having contributed, even unintentionally, to everything reaching that point. Julia was shaking, sitting on the floor, her hands on her face. She said she felt ashamed, that she now saw the value of everything she had lost. But Thomas simply said that forgiveness was not the problem. He had already forgiven. The problem was that, by forgiving, he had also understood that he no longer wanted to go back. That moving on was his way of loving himself. Of respecting himself. Julia asked for a chance, insisted that she could change. That she wanted to go back to being who she was. But he calmly replied that their love had ended the moment she chose another path. And that, no matter how much tenderness he felt, there was no room for new beginnings. She stood up slowly, took the box back, looked at him one last time and said that if he ever wanted to talk, she would be there. But he knew he wouldn't care. And neither did she. Because there, in that room, everything had been said. And everything had been understood. When he closed the door behind her, Thomas didn't feel angry. He felt relief. Because, finally, the truth had been told. And with it, came the peace he had been searching for. But fate still had one last surprise in store. Something he hadn't expected. Something that would change everything, again. And this time, he wouldn't be the one to suffer the consequences. 2 months had passed since that morning when Julia knocked on the door and left behind, not only the words she had spoken, but the painful certainty that, for the first time, Thomas would not go back. The house remained in order, the routine maintained its silent rituals, but there was a new lightness in every corner. Her absence no longer hurt, it was just absence. The sound of his own footsteps echoing down the hallway had stopped being melancholic and had become part of the new beginning. He had moved some furniture around, remodeled the office, changed the paintings in the living room. Small gestures of reconstruction. There was no rush, no euphoria, just the mature tranquility of someone who had weathered the storm and now, even without sun, had learned to enjoy the breeze. It was in a bookstore, late one afternoon, that Thomas saw her again. Not Julia. Another woman. She was sitting in one of the armchairs in the reading area, with a book open on her lap and a cup of coffee in her hand. She wore discreet glasses, her hair tied in a loose bun, and she had a way of crossing her legs that drew attention not for its sensuality but for its confidence. He hadn't intended to start a conversation, but he stumbled, literally, as he swerved to avoid a display and she smiled. One of those simple, spontaneous smiles that don't expect anything in return. He apologized, she made a light comment about the excessively piled books, and before they knew it, they were talking about Latin American literature, then about small cafes in small towns, and before they realized it, it was already night. Her name was Helena. She was an editor, recently transferred to the city, coming off a difficult breakup, but with a sweetness in her voice that contrasted with the history she carried. There was no pressure, no promises. Just meetings that happened naturally, slow walks, long conversations and the feeling of being in front of someone who didn't want to fix him, just get to know him. Helena had a firm gaze, but a serene soul. She didn't demand explanations about the past, but she didn't shy away from her own either. She spoke frankly and listened with empathy. For the first time in a long time, Thomas felt like he didn't need to control anything, just live. And that was enough. Max liked her, lay at her feet and slept peacefully. It was as if this new chapter was being written in a different language, softer, more mature, more sincere. Meanwhile, Julia was immersed in a void that was hard to name. The days dragged on between classes, repetitive tasks, and a fatigue that wasn't physical. The messages she still insisted on sending were not answered. She had tried to leave notes in his mailbox, a handwritten letter on his gate, but she never received a reply. She began to watch from afar. She saw Thomas leave with Helena one night, the two of them walking side by side with their shoulders almost touching, as if they shared the same step, the same breath. That image stuck in her mind like a film without sound, but with all the feelings wide open. The pain of watching life go on without you is a silent but devastating punishment. And Julia felt that every day. Renato, on the other hand, was no longer in the city. He had requested a transfer after the scandal of an inappropriate relationship with a school employee. It wasn't Julia who reported him, but the gossip, the sidelong glances, and the loss of respect were enough for him to realize that his game was over. He left without saying goodbye to her, without explanation. He simply disappeared. Julia was left with the pieces. With the shame. With the judgments. And, most of all, with the loneliness. One day, when she returned from the publishing house, Helena noticed a strange envelope in Thomas's mailbox. It was addressed to him, but there was no return address. Curious, she handed it to him carefully and made to leave the room to give him privacy, but he invited her to stay. She opened the envelope calmly and found a single sheet of paper, with handwriting she recognized immediately. It was from Julia. She wasn't writing to ask for another chance. Not this time. The content was different. She told him something she had kept hidden for years, something Thomas had never known. During college, even before they started dating, Julia had fallen in love with him from afar. She watched from afar, sat close to him in the library, memorized his class schedules. But there was someone else in her life at the time. An abusive relationship, from which she tried unsuccessfully to get out. When she finally managed to break up, she got closer to Thomas. She never told him about that chapter, she never thought it was necessary. Until the day she discovered that, during the first week of dating, she still exchanged messages with her ex, afraid of reprisals. She never saw him, nor got physically involved. But she hid it. And this secret, kept for so long, weighed heavily as a reminder that she had started the relationship with an omission. She said that perhaps she never had the courage to tell him for fear of losing the only man who truly loved her. And that now, looking back, she saw that it was this fear that always made her hide parts of herself, until hiding became a habit. She ended the letter by saying that he owed her nothing. That his happiness was the only thing left of everything they had lived. And that she accepted that. But she needed him to know. Thomas folded the letter slowly, put it in his desk drawer, and said nothing for a few seconds. Helena looked at him silently, respecting the moment. Then he took a deep breath and said he wasn't angry. He was just sad that she had carried it alone for so long. He said that, in the end, each of them had learned to survive with hidden pieces. And that perhaps, if they had talked more courageously years ago, everything would have been different. But now it didn't matter. Because the pain was no longer his. It was a memory. A trace on his skin. And he had someone in front of him who didn't demand that he forget the past. Just that he be present. Weeks later, during a literary event where Helena was launching a collection of short stories, Thomas was invited to speak. He went up on the small stage, took the microphone and told a brief story, not theirs, but of a man who lost everything while trying to save something that needed two people to be maintained. He said that love only survives if both are willing to take off their masks, to let themselves be seen completely, even on bad days. The audience gave a standing ovation. And Julia, sitting in the back, disguised among the guests, couldn't hold back her tears. She knew those words were his. But they were no longer for her. At the end of the night, Julia approached. Helena watched from afar, without jealousy, just attentive. Julia thanked him. She said she didn't expect anything more, that she just wanted to wish him happiness. And that, despite everything, she still considered him the best chapter of her life. Thomas smiled sincerely and, with a brief handshake, said goodbye. And with that gesture, the two finally closed the cycle. Not with resentment, not with pain. But with maturity. With the understanding that sometimes love ends. And that's okay. The following week, Thomas and Helena traveled to a small coastal town. They rented a simple house with a balcony overlooking the sea. They spent the days reading, cooking together, laughing over silly things. And one silent afternoon, she told him she felt safe with him. That it was like coming home after years away. He held her hand and, looking at the horizon, replied that that was exactly what he felt. That perhaps everything he had experienced had prepared him for that moment. And for the first time in a long time, there was no pain, no doubt, no shadows. Just a new love, built on truth, peace, and the freedom to be who you are, without hiding anything. Because when love is whole, it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be honest. And in that honesty, he finally found himself. The morning dawned slowly, with a slightly gray sky and a warm breeze that swayed the curtains on the balcony as if time were also rebuilding itself along with them. Helena was still asleep, her body slightly bent to the left side, her breathing light and deep. Thomas, next to her, already awake, kept his eyes fixed on the ceiling, feeling the silent texture of a day that was beginning differently. Not because of events, but because of sensations. It was as if, after so much walking among emotional ruins, I was finally stepping on solid ground, without cracks. This was not just a new chapter, it was a new language. He got up slowly, made coffee in silence, sat down with a cup in his hands and thought about everything he had experienced. The house they were in was rented, but it already bore traces of them. Helena's books piled in random order, a colorful blanket she had brought from her childhood, the two pairs of slippers at the door. That simplicity said more about starting over than any elaborate plan. And it was there, in the silence of the cafe, that he understood the value of time that does not press, just surrenders. In the days that followed, the routine took shape effortlessly. Helena worked from home sometimes, Thomas held occasional meetings via video call, but there were no emergencies, no rushing around. Their relationship was based on calm, on the deep respect that arises when two people meet without feeling the need to be saved. He no longer wanted to fix anyone. And she didn't expect him to be perfect. It was light, but not superficial. There was depth in the silences they shared, in the way he observed her details without invading her, in the way she leaned in to listen to him even in the most everyday stories. It was this kind of connection that made him realize how much he had adapted to discomfort for so long, how much he had normalized absence just to sustain an idea of love that, in fact, had already emptied out. Despite this, not everything was so straightforward. The memory of what he had experienced with Julia sometimes appeared as a shadow, not as regret, but as a memory of another version of himself. A man who tolerated too much, who kept quiet in the name of stability, who confused patience with omission. Now, he looked at the past with different eyes. He knew he had made a mistake by not speaking, by pretending that everything was fine, by emotionally withdrawing while there was still time to save. But he also knew that he was not the only one responsible. And this understanding freed him. The pain had left marks, yes, but not open wounds. Only scars that now told the story of a man who had learned to listen to himself. One Sunday, Thomas received an unexpected invitation. A former college friend was organizing a small get-together, a sort of informal reunion. He decided to go. Helena encouraged him, saying that he could take the opportunity to see old friends and breathe new stories. When he got there, he met faces that had long been hidden only in old photos. The conversations flowed lightly, filled with laughter and memories, until a name came up. Julia. Someone mentioned that she had transferred to a school in another city. They said that she was now more introspective, distant from social media, more reserved. It was not said with mockery or judgment, just as an observation. Thomas listened in silence, without interrupting. He felt a small knot in his stomach, not from longing, but from reflection. He wondered how she was really doing. If she had managed to rebuild herself, if she had learned something from all that, if she had found a new way of being. When he got home, he found Helena in the kitchen, peeling tangerines and listening to French music. He sat down across from her and watched. She noticed his look, stopped the music, and asked how their reunion had gone. He told her everything, including about Julia. He said there was no hard feelings, but that thinking about her still made him look at his own reflection. Helena simply nodded, with the calm of someone who understands that the other person's past is not a threat, but rather part of the path that brought them here. That night, they slept hand in hand, without needing to say anything else. And for the first time in a long time, Thomas felt that the future was not a distant place, but a light continuation of the present. Meanwhile, Julia walked through new streets, in a city she still didn't know completely. The people there didn't know who she was, and that was both liberating and lonely. The new school was smaller, her classmates more formal, the pace less intense. She spent her nights alone, often rereading her old diaries, trying to understand when exactly she had lost herself. There was no more Renato, no close friends, no one she could tell the details of her feelings to. It was just her and the emptiness left by the choices she had made. But, little by little, she was also changing. She started taking yoga classes, started writing to herself again, and renovated the simple apartment where she now lived. Not because she expected to be forgiven or win him back, but because she felt she needed to find who she was before anything else. For the first time, she didn't want to hide what she had done. She wanted to understand. And this process hurt more than any external judgment. One day, when she received an invitation from her old school to pay tribute to its oldest teachers, she hesitated. She didn't want to meet anyone again, nor to be reminded of a past that she was now trying to forget. But she ended up accepting, driven by a strange need to face head-on what she once was. She arrived at the venue with timid steps, but was greeted cordially. Thomas wasn't there. Neither was Helena. But some old colleagues hugged her sincerely, saying that they missed her ideas, her energy. She thanked them, kept her composure and stayed until the end of the ceremony. When she left, she sat on the bench in front of the school garden and stayed there, watching the students pass by, as if searching for something in time that would never come back. She took out her cell phone, opened the gallery and saw an old photo of her and Thomas, smiling on a sunny day. She didn't cry. She just smiled slightly, like someone who finally accepts that there are stories that don't end with a return, but with understanding. Helena, in turn, was also facing her own ghosts. Before meeting Thomas, she had been in a relationship where she had been silenced and ignored. So when she realized that her feelings for Thomas were becoming deeper, she felt afraid. Afraid of losing herself again. But when she saw the way he looked at her, how he listened to her even when she didn't say anything, she began to realize that there was room for her to be whole. And that motivated her to share with him parts of her story that she had never told another man. And when he listened, he didn't try to solve it. He just stayed present. And that presence was the answer she needed. One night, sitting by the sea, she asked him if he still thought about Julia. He answered honestly, sometimes yes, but not with a desire to return. Only as one thinks about a book that was important, but has already been read and understood. Helena nodded. And with a slight smile, she said that she hoped it was a book he would still want to reread every day. He pulled her close, and in that long, silent embrace, they sealed a promise that needed no words. Because some truths do not need to be spoken when the bodies already understand them. But even in the most serene stories, life always has one last curve in store. An invitation, a coincidence, a dilemma. Something that demands more from the heart than it has ever given. And it was precisely this next step that was approaching, subtle and inevitable, like a tide that rises without warning. And when it arrived, none of the three would be prepared for what would come. Autumn arrived with its cold mornings and golden afternoons, dyeing the sidewalks with dry leaves that crackled under the footsteps of those who walked the streets distractedly. Helena had been invited to participate in a literary panel in another city and Thomas, without hesitation, decided to accompany her. The car ride was long, but comfortably silent. As he drove, he watched the way she looked at the road, as if each curve revealed more than geography, it revealed some forgotten part of herself. They spoke little during the first few hours, not for lack of subject matter, but because of the calm harmony of two bodies that no longer needed to fill time with words. When they stopped for lunch at a roadside restaurant, they sat near the window and Helena commented that, since they had met, trips had stopped being escapes and had become returns. Thomas smiled, but his eyes took a second longer than usual to react. Helena noticed. And even without saying anything, he kept his silence as if it were a closed box. He knew that sometimes, what he carried was not pain, but memory. Arriving at the hotel, they were greeted with the discreet formality of an academic event. Helena went straight to the conference room, while Thomas settled into his room. He turned on the television, but quickly turned it off. He lay down on the light bedspread and stared at the ceiling. Everything was fine, everything was right. But something in his chest seemed to be stirring, a subtle restlessness, as if time was telling him that there were still more pages to be written before the final point. Later, when he went down to watch the presentation, he sat at the back of the auditorium. Helena spoke clearly, had mastered the subject, was confident but sensitive. Watching her there, on that stage, aroused in him an admiration that went beyond enchantment. It was pride. It was a silent recognition that he had found someone capable of walking alongside him, without taking his place or demanding that he take hers. At the end of the panel, she found him in the lobby and threw herself into his arms with genuine joy. Thomas laughed, kissed her forehead, and told her that she had been brilliant. And she, with shining eyes, said that it wouldn't have been possible without him. But deep down, he knew, she would have been. And that made everything even more beautiful. On the way back from the trip, during a stop at a small street bookstore, Helena bought a book of old poems and, while leafing through it in the car, found a note between the pages. It was a dedication dated years ago, written by a woman to a man she loved. The text spoke about choices, about the courage to let go, about love that sometimes needs to be left to blossom in another soil. Helena read it aloud, without knowing that this message would be the catalyst for a moment of revelation that Thomas had been putting off for weeks. When she finished, he was silent for a few minutes, then he parked the car on the shoulder, turned to her and, with his eyes fixed on hers, said that there was something he needed to tell her. It was about Julia. More precisely, about an unexpected encounter that had happened weeks before, without him mentioning it. One afternoon, as he was leaving the market, he saw her on the other side of the street. She was alone, sitting on a bench, with a notebook on her lap. Her eyes were lost, but her expression no longer carried the urgency it had before, it was resigned. Thomas crossed the street without knowing why. He sat down next to her, and they exchanged glances and said nothing for several minutes. Then she spoke. She said she hadn't expected to see him, that she didn't want to bother him, but that sometimes she still wrote him letters, even if she didn't send them. He listened. He said he understood. And then she took one of those letters out of her bag. She didn't give it to him. She just read it out loud. It was a text about regret, but not the kind that begs for forgiveness, the kind that acknowledges. That understands. That accepts the consequences. After reading it, she smiled with tears in her eyes and said she just wanted him to know that she was trying to be a better person, even if he never saw her again. And Thomas, with a lump in his throat, replied that he wished that for her. That he really did. And then he got up and left. Telling Helena about this at that moment, there on the side of the road, was like lifting a weight off his chest. Not out of guilt, but out of respect. He didn't owe her an explanation, but he chose to give one. Because the foundation of what he had built with her did not accept omissions. Helena listened to everything without interrupting. When he finished, she took a deep breath, squeezed his hand, and said she wasn't hurt. She was just grateful. Grateful for having someone by her side who was capable of sharing even the hardest things. And that, if it had been her, he would have done the same. Thomas smiled. Relieved. Touched. Not because he had been understood, but because he had found someone with whom the truth was possible. In the days that followed, life resumed its rhythm. But there was a dilemma that now silently inhabited Thomas. A doubt that did not concern Julia, nor Helena, but himself. It was the question that every survivor of deep pain asks himself, am I truly whole anymore? Is the love I feel now complete or just a gentle balm on old wounds? This doubt followed him like a shadow, even in the happiest moments. Not because he doubted Helena. But because he feared, deep down, that he was living by contrast, loving by comparison, by relief, by gratitude. And that, although true, was still not all he knew he could give. One cold afternoon, while they were walking together in a park, Helena surprised him by saying that she had received an offer to coordinate an editorial project abroad. It wasn't permanent, but it would require a temporary move of months. She said it with her eyes downcast, as if she didn't want to hurt anyone but needed to be honest. Thomas felt his stomach churn. Not because of the offer, but because of the real possibility of separation. And it was at that exact moment that he understood that the answer to his doubt was there. If he were just grateful, he would let her go without pain. But the idea of losing her now was unbearable. Because, unlike in the past, where love was mixed with fear, with Helena it was different. He loved freely, but he didn't want her absence. And that changed everything. They sat on a bench and he spoke. He said he was willing to go with her, that he would leave everything behind, that he would start from scratch by her side if necessary. But she refused. She said she would never accept him giving up on himself again. That she didn't love him because he was able to follow her, but because he had learned to find himself. Thomas then replied that he wasn't giving up. He was choosing. And choosing, sometimes, is also a way of remaining whole. Helena looked at him for a long time and, with moist eyes, said she needed a few days to think. Not because she doubted his love, but because she was afraid of the speed at which life was changing again. And he respected that. He didn't try to convince her. He just said he would be there. Whenever she wanted. That night, he returned home alone. He made some tea, sat on the porch and looked at the sky. He thought about all the choices he had made. About all the versions of you that had ever existed. And in that moment, he understood that his life no longer needed repairs. Only courage. And that sometimes the truest love is the one that doesn't hold you back, but offers itself as a home. Even if the other person has to leave for a while. And it was with this new understanding that he prepared himself for the outcome that was yet to come. Without fear. Without rushing. But with his heart whole, finally. The morning Helena returned was silent. There was no note on the door, no message announcing her arrival. Just the discreet sound of the key turning in the lock, the soft creak of the wood, and the familiar smell that filled the air as if asking permission to stay. Thomas was in the kitchen, cutting slices of still warm bread, when he saw her standing at the door with a small suitcase by her side and a look that offered neither apologies nor explanations. It was the look of someone who had come back by choice, not by necessity. She walked over to him, touched his face with one hand, and said that in her entire trip, she had found no place that felt more like home than that house. He didn't answer right away, just wrapped her in a long, tight, silent hug, where the past no longer mattered and the future didn't need to be planned. It was a calm reunion, without euphoria, like two rivers that join after traveling long, separate curves. The suitcase was forgotten in the hallway, and the coffee that morning tasted like permanence. Months passed. Helena began to coordinate the editorial project remotely, with the same competence as always, but now with the lightness of someone who had made an emotional, and not a professional, choice. She and Thomas renovated the guest room, transforming it into a small reading and work studio, and there they spent hours sharing ideas, writing, listening to music or simply sharing silence. Nothing was forced, nothing needed to be proven. Just lived. It was in this new rhythm, in this emotional maturity that was established without the need for oaths, that they grew stronger as a couple. The small arguments did not scare them, the silences did not separate them, the differences did not threaten them. Because there was truth, and the truth sustained everything. Julia, on the other hand, followed a less linear path. Moving to another city had brought her the fresh start she had feared so much, but which ended up being necessary. By accepting that there would be no going back, that some doors, once closed, never open again, she began to live differently. She enrolled in a creative writing course, reconnected with old friends she had left behind, and began volunteering at an institution that welcomed women in vulnerable situations. There, amidst stories of overcoming and open wounds, she realized that her pain, although legitimate, could be transformed into a tool. She no longer tried to explain what she had done, nor did she seek justifications. She began to write about losses, about wrong choices, about second chances that never come. Her texts gained strength and eventually began to be shared by other women. It was as if her pain, once so silent, now found an echo in other voices. It was not about redemption, but about awareness. Julia never sought Thomas again. Not through letters, not through messages, not through glances. She knew that it would be just an empty scream. And she preferred respectful silence. She knew that the place she once occupied had been transformed, not replaced, but rebuilt with other bricks. And understanding this was the last stage of her process of maturity. One afternoon, Julia received an invitation to speak at an event about emotional reconstruction. She hesitated. The event would be in the city where everything had fallen apart. But she accepted. When she got there, she checked into a discreet hotel, walked through the streets with a nostalgic and mature look, passed by her old school, but did not go inside. On the day of the event, she spoke with a firmness that surprised even herself. She told her story without sparing details, without minimizing mistakes, but also without victimizing herself. She said that betrayals do not begin with hidden kisses, but with cultivated silences. That no pain justifies hurting the other, but that every mistake can teach us, as long as it is faced with courage. The audience was silent at the end. Some people cried, others gave her a standing ovation. But most importantly, she left there with the certainty that her story no longer hurt her. It was just part of what made her who she was now. Meanwhile, Thomas and Helena were organizing a small ceremony at home. It wasn't a wedding, it wasn't a traditional celebration. It was a gathering of close friends, an afternoon of music and wine, a kind of intimate ritual to seal something that already existed before it was even named. Sitting under the lights hanging in the garden, they exchanged improvised vows, words spoken without rehearsal but with truth. Thomas said that, with her, he learned that love doesn't need to be patched up, it can be embroidered anew. Helena said that, with him, she understood that true freedom is loving without fear of loss. And there, among friends, laughter and exchanged glances, they celebrated what they had built, not a perfect story, but a real story, full of twists, turns, returns and advances. A story where love was born from honesty and mutual choice. Renato was never seen again. He left traces in another city, new stories, new bonds, but his definitive absence from Giulia's life was, deep down, the only answer she needed. He never wanted to build anything, only to inhabit spaces of emotional insecurity. And it was this realization that, ironically, freed Giulia to look at herself with more compassion and less guilt. She understood that forgiving herself was the first step to starting over, but that, before that, she needed to accept that some wounds are not healed to be forgotten, but to serve as a warning. Renato was a confusing but necessary chapter. And although he left scars, he no longer had the power to dictate the course of her life. Years later, Thomas published a book. He didn't use real names or exact dates. It was a work of fiction inspired by real pain, a novel about loss, reconnection, and mature love. The book became a hit among readers who were looking for more than romance, they were looking for reflection. Giulia read it. She bought it at an airport, by chance, without knowing it was his. Only when she read the first few pages did she recognize the tone. She read it all in one night. She cried, smiled, reflected. And at the end, she closed the book, put it on the table, and said to herself, he did it. And that was enough. Helena, when she read the manuscript before publication, said only one thing, now the world will know how great you are. And he responded with a light kiss on the top of her head, but only you know who I have become. This story ends without applause, without fireworks, without major twists at the last minute. Because real life doesn't need a spectacle to be grand. Sometimes, the greatest impact is the silence of rediscovered peace. The sound of coffee being served in the kitchen in the morning, the touch of one hand on another in the late afternoon, the smell of a new book being leafed through on the porch. And each character who has come this far, with their pain, their mistakes, their choices, has found a way to move on. Not like before. But better than before. Now that you've listened this far, tell me in the comments, what did you think of this story? Did it touch you? What was the most powerful moment for you? I really want to know your opinion, so comment below, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any stories like this. And always remember, betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It tears apart trust, drains affection, and often robs people of what's most pure, the ability to trust again. Every betrayal is a choice. And every choice comes with a price. Here on the channel, we do not support any type of betrayal under any circumstances. The stories are fiction, but the feelings are real. And the lesson is clear, take care of those who love you. Be true. Because when you lose trust, sometimes there is no going back. Until the next story.